Tiananmen Square, June 4th, 1989. That's all it takes to get over 1 billion people banned from seeing this video. On that day in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, the Chinese government brutally suppressed a weeks-long protest against the failures of its regime. While many in the West have heard of it or will recognize its iconic images, few understand what it was all for or how it all ended so tragically. Today, on A Day in History, we will tell the story of the protest China once erased from history, why it started, how it escalated, and the brutal end that China is desperate to keep secret. If that sounds interesting to you, then be sure to like and subscribe to keep up with more videos like this one. The late 1980s were a bad time for communism. The USSR was on its last legs, and Eastern Europe was throwing off the shackles of Soviet oppression, while the capitalist West was stronger than ever. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, was the world's largest Marxist-Leninist party, and before long it would be the only one still in control of a major nation. Within China, the dubious legacy of Mao's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution had disillusioned many, while Chairman Deng Xiaoping had embarked upon economic liberalization to roll back state control and allow more capitalistic elements into China's economy. But China's economy still lagged heavily behind other major nations in complexity, technology, and quality of life, with sharp wealth inequality between classes and regions. It is no surprise that the 80s were a decade of simmering discontent then, especially as technology and mass media made Chinese people more aware of the outside world than ever before. Western prosperity and democratic attitudes had an illuminating influence, especially students, who saw China as a stagnating and stifling place, where corruption and nepotism were the only paths to success. The roots of Tiananmen can be found in the student protests of 1986 to 87. Thousands of students had protested against economic stagnation and state intrusion upon student life and student politics. The protests had broken out across China's universities between December 1986 and January 1987, in one of the largest signs of popular discontent against the CCP since the revolution. There were no dramatic scenes of violence, although many people, ranging from government ministers to academics, were dismissed for their perceived softness or encouragement of the protests. Among these was Hu Yaobang, the General Secretary of the CCP, who was dismissed from his post in January 1987 for being too sympathetic to the protesters. Hu became something of a hero to China's discontented students. Minor protests simmered away through 1987 and 1988, keeping the issues alive. But it was Hu's death in April 1989 that would trigger the conflagration of Tiananmen. Hu Yaobang died on April 15, 1989. Although the party had sidelined him, he was still a major official and there was no stopping the public mourning for him. His death triggered an outburst of grief and anger from the students who had seen him as one of the few CCP officials who might have listened to them. One poem found at Beijing University read, "The honest man is dead. The hypocrites live on. The enthusiasm is dead. Indifference buried him." A memorial was held for Hu in Beijing on April 17th, but it quickly became a demonstration. By noon, some 10,000 students and protesters had arrived, reigniting the causes of anti-corruption and pro-democracy that Hu had been sympathetic to back in 87. Hu's death was really just a pretext, one protester said. "We came here because we have something to say. I don't think we'll achieve anything, but it's better to do something than nothing." The students had no single leader, but a number of people emerged as influential voices who shifted the direction of the movement. Students Wang Dan and Wu Kaishi became some of the most recognizable faces of the movement. Psychology graduate student Chai Ling emerged as one of the more aggressive leaders, calling for greater provocation of the government to force their hand. Western observers often oversimplify what the protests were about. It was not merely about democracy, nor was it about overthrowing China's dictatorship for a Western liberal-style system. The primary complaints were to address flaws within the system, not destroy it completely. The corruption of top party officials, the nepotism that kept opportunities in the hands of the families of party leaders, wealth inequality, and limited democratization of things like student politics were the main concerns. Although some certainly went further, the majority of those who took to the streets were not seeking the abolition of communism or the CCP. China's modern history was filled with celebrated examples of student protest, including the 1919 May 4th movement and Mao's Cultural Revolution. And the party found itself in a difficult position to come up with an explanation for why their beloved students were now turning upon them. Like many communist regimes, the idea that the interests of the regime might have diverged from the interests of the people it claimed to represent never seemed to cross their mind. From the start, the CCP assumed that an evil conspiracy by anti-communist agents, most likely foreign, had misled the masses into protesting to serve their own selfish ulterior motives. By April 20th, the police were sent into Tiananmen Square to arrest hundreds of protesters. One student was beaten unconscious. But for every protester arrested, more seemed to join. At the same time, protests emerged in other cities. Wuhan, Nanjing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Changsha, Xi'an, and more saw crowds of thousands turn out in solidarity with the Beijing protests, all demanding reform, freedom, and accountability from their government. By the time Hu's funeral was held in Beijing on April 22nd, there were at least 100,000 protesters in the capital, chanting, "Dialogue, dialogue, we demand dialogue." The government instituted strict censorship of the protests. Newspapers who reported on it were shut down or banned, but containing a movement of this scale proved futile. By April 23rd, party leadership had moved from calling them protests to turmoil. Premier Li Peng described it as a moment of struggle with bourgeois liberalism. Deng Xiaoping's attitude was simple. "Don't be afraid of students," he told his advisors, "because we still have millions of soldiers." Except Deng's statement missed a growing reality, that most of the protesters were no longer students. Their attacks on corruption, oppression, and nepotism had mass appeal. Soon the workers, provincials, and city folk were marching as well. As arrests rose, authorities realized the people they were arresting came from all walks of life. This was no longer just a student movement, but a unifying movement for anyone in China. On April 26, the official CCP line appeared in an article in the state newspaper People's Daily. It denounced the protests as turmoil and blamed the unrest on a conspiracy by a small number of people, most likely foreigners, who were trying to destroy China. Rather than stem the tide, the article infuriated the protesters. They felt insulted and ignored, and it triggered a new surge in numbers. General Secretary of the CCP, Zhao Ziyang, recognized the gravity of the situation, but also the legitimacy of the protests. He urged dialogue with the students and cautioned party leadership to separate the mass of students with legitimate grievances from the alleged band of conspirators directing it. In this, he was fiercely opposed by Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng. May 4, 1989 marked the 70th anniversary of the 1919 May 4th movement. Back in 1919, student protests in Tiananmen Square against the corruption and inefficiency of the Chinese government had undermined its authority and been a formative moment for China's nascent communist movement. The parallels with 1989 did not go unnoticed. Some 1.5 million protesters were now in the streets of the capital, as the protests became a mass rejection of the failures of the current system. Nowhere in China seemed to escape the protesting waves, and numerous smaller causes became wrapped up in the wider movement. In Xinjiang, for example, uranium miners staged sit-ins to protest horrible working conditions, while Inner Mongolia saw protests attacking failures in the education system. By mid-May, it was obvious that popular sympathies lay with the protesters. As the government refused to negotiate, the protest leaders escalated their methods. On May 11th, over 1,000 students in Tiananmen Square began a hunger strike. Either the government opened dialogue, or it would be letting its children starve in the streets. Hunger strikes held a special potency in the protests, as a stark contrast with the extravagant banquets and gluttony associated with the Chinese elite. The timing was terrible for the CCP. On May 15th, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in Beijing for talks. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets, and all the world's media was there to witness it. The protests totally overshadowed Gorbachev's visit, and in a humiliating sign of the government's loss of control, they had to bring him into the Great Hall of the People by a side entrance to avoid the protesters. Party leadership had reached its limit. At a meeting on May 17th, Deng insisted that martial law would need to be declared to restore order. Zhao was horrified. By some estimates, there were 1 million people protesting in the capital as they were meeting. The Chinese people cannot take any more policy blunders, Zhao warned, fearing that a heavy-handed response would only exacerbate things. His pleas failed to stop the martial law plan going ahead, but his calls for dialogue were not totally ignored. On May 18th, Premier Li Peng agreed to meet with the student leaders, including Wang Dan and Wu Kai-shi, inside the Great Hall of the People. The meeting was broadcast on national television as the entire nation watched on with bated breath. Wu Kai-shi appeared at the meeting in hospital pajamas, with an oxygen tube still fitted, having been beaten badly by the police a few days earlier. He did not even allow Premier Li Peng to finish his opening statement before launching into a critical tirade. Li Peng had no interest in conceding anything and was offended at the lack of respect they showed him. The students soon realized the meeting was going nowhere and nothing was agreed. When Li Peng reached out to shake the protest leaders' hands as he left, they all snubbed him. "You've gone too far," he warned ominously, before storming out. Under Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping's direction, martial law came into effect on May 20th. 23 divisions of the People's Liberation Army (PLA), supplemented with helicopters, tanks, and other armored vehicles, descended upon Beijing. At least one army commando was stripped of his rank for refusing to go along with the orders. The PLA men had been told to expect counter-revolutionary thugs, but instead found the regular civilians of Beijing standing peacefully against them. They peacefully blocked roads, either with their bodies, makeshift barricades, or vehicles to halt the soldiers' advance. The capital was completely paralyzed. More antagonistic crowds lectured the soldiers on why they were wrong, while others brought them food and water. The failed intervention did nothing to slow the tide of new protesters joining the crowds, and by the time the soldiers were withdrawn on May 23rd, the protests had only gotten larger. Being incapable of recognizing its own failings, Deng and the CCP leadership blamed Secretary Zhao and his allies for causing division within the party, and somehow interfering with the martial law strategy. Zhao was sidelined and cut out from official meetings, eliminating one of the only voices of restraint among party leadership. On May 25th, Zhao was stripped of his position and accused of being part of an anti-party conspiracy to aid the protests. But just as the CCP leadership was fracturing, so too was the protest. Its vague goals of democratization and anti-corruption had broad appeal, but offered little direction. The inspiring resistance to the martial law declaration could not overcome the fact that the protests had now dragged on for weeks, with no real progress on the vague issues they'd set out to change. Protest leaders in Tiananmen Square debated their next moves. Some insisted on a final mass demonstration on May 28th before heading home. Others suggested waiting until June 20th, when the next session of the National People's Congress would be called. This paralysis only sapped the momentum of the protests even further, and several leaders departed over the disagreements. In the end, the rest of the leaders decided to stay on. Wang Dan announced that the occupation of the square would continue, at least until the next session of Congress, but suggested it might end earlier if an emergency session was called first. But the government had no interest in waiting, and the martial law decision was still in place. On the night of June 2nd, troops moved in again. This time, they disguised themselves as civilians, moving in on foot or in unmarked trucks, aiming to get into position before the protesters could realize what was happening and block the roads. It was only by tragic accident that one of the jeeps accidentally crashed into a crowd of civilians, killing 3 people. Crowds dragged the occupants from the vehicle, only to discover military uniforms, maps, and equipment hidden inside. Word spread like wildfire through the city. Crowds rushed to block the roads once again and raise new barriers. No matter how inventive the PLA got, they were thwarted. For example, one group of soldiers disguised themselves as a jogging group to get into position near Tiananmen Square. They were stopped by suspicious civilians who soon determined their identities and stole their shoes before sending them away. Such harmless encounters would soon disappear. By midday on June 3rd, the regular police and troops were back on the streets, and violent clashes broke out. Stones and bottles were thrown at the police, who fired back with tear gas. There would be no peaceful infiltration. Plans for a full-on assault would go into effect from 9 p.m. that evening. The PLA would clear Tiananmen Square, even if they had to cut through the people of Beijing to do it. The protesters knew this, and many began arming themselves with metal pipes and simple tools, swearing their commitment to stand their ground no matter the cost. Around 9 p.m., the operation began. Soldiers advanced with armored vehicles at their backs and helicopters circling overhead. They were told to use whatever means necessary to carve a path to the square. The Gongchufen intersection, about 7 kilometers from Tiananmen, had been blocked by protesters, who'd set up buses and trucks to close the road. This time, the troops did not stop. The armored vehicles smashed through the barriers, and when the crowds refused to move, they opened fire. The crowds broke into chaos. Dozens were shot dead as the PLA advanced, and the sounds of gunfire warned the rest of the city that the government's patience was at an end. Just after 10 p.m., the advancing soldiers reached the crossroads at the Mushidi Bridge. Thousands of protesters formed a human chain, hoping to stop the soldiers while demonstrating their peaceful intent. Without warning, the troops opened fire again. The chain shattered as the soldiers kept firing, and tanks rolled over those who weren't fast enough to escape. The number of dead and injured was already in the thousands. Most resistance was ineffective. However, the PLA did suffer casualties. In one case, protesters managed to swarm an armored vehicle, drag its commanding officer out, and kill him. It was a gruesome display that CCP propaganda loved to publicize in the years afterwards as proof of the protesters' evil. By 11:30 p.m., the PLA had reached the square. Makeshift barriers delayed them, and the remaining protesters threw Molotov cocktails to beat them back. Around midnight, an armored car broke through, but was swiftly burned with Molotovs. 2 of the soldiers inside were beaten to death by the crowd, with a third narrowly being saved by other protesters. The assault continued, and by 1 a.m., troops had broken into the square as loudspeakers demanded their total surrender. The announcements assured the people of Beijing that the PLA is the friend of the people, and no good person need fear it, even as bodies of civilians still lay along the bloody several-kilometer path its tanks had cut through to the heart of the city. As PLA tanks rolled over protesters' tents and its soldiers beat and shot at protesters, the loudspeakers continued to drone. The People's Liberation Army loves the people. The people love the PLA. Only bad people do not love the army. As dawn broke on June 4th, just a few hundred students remained hemmed in to the southeastern corner of Tiananmen Square. But by 6 a.m., they had all been arrested or fled. Suppression continued elsewhere in the city throughout the morning, with dozens more victims ranging from doctors to schoolchildren. The bodies of many student protesters were taken back to Beijing University, where student groups denounced the fascist massacre of their classmates. Meanwhile, hospitals struggled to cope with the massive amounts of dead and injured. For example, Fuxing Hospital was overwhelmed and could confirm at least 42 deaths by mid-morning. Families of the protesters gathered outside hospitals to get news of their loved ones or mourn their loss. It was later in the morning of June 4th along Chang'an Avenue that AP photographer Jeff Widener spotted a man standing in the path of advancing tanks. The tank man, with his simple clothes and shopping bag, stood alone in their path and moved whenever they tried to go around him. His identity and motives have remained a mystery ever since. Contrary to popular myth, the tanks did not run him over. Soldiers came and took him away after a few minutes, but not before Widener could capture the photo that would become iconic of the entire movement. The crackdown in Tiananmen shocked the world. When news of the massacre in the capital spread, their fellow protesters in the other cities kept up the fight. In Shanghai, for example, 30,000 protesters remained to block the streets, and a large number of workers refused to show up to work in solidarity. However, the government's ruthless display was enough to shatter the momentum of the remaining protests. Over the next 48 hours, virtually all the protests fizzled out, some with more aggressive suppression than others. In Chengdu, protesters clung on until June 8th, but aggressive police action, including the arrest and beating of hundreds of people, eventually brought them to heel. The leaders of the Tiananmen protests scattered. Wang Dan surrendered himself to authorities rather than flee, which landed him a lengthy jail sentence. Other leaders like Wu Kaishi and Chai Ling chose to flee into exile. Meanwhile, former General Secretary Zhao was called before the party plenum in late June, where he refused to recant his attempts to restrain the government. He was quietly placed under loose house arrest and died in relative obscurity. Upon his death in 2005, newspapers were barred from reporting anything more than 59 words in his obituary, and the mourners at his funeral were not even allowed to bring flowers. The world's media had seen everything, and international condemnation flowed in. Alas, none of this condemnation resulted in serious change, nor did the CCP seem at all bothered by it. Premier Li Peng, who bore more direct responsibility for the massacre, never seemed to care about his unofficial nickname of the Butcher of Beijing. Chairman Deng didn't bat an eyelid. When asked about whether the number of dead was worth it, Deng coldly answered, "In China, even 1 million dead would be considered a small price." When Deng made his first public appearance after the massacre on June 9th, he called for a moment's silence to honor only the soldiers who had died murdering their own people. This conspiracy of silence has continued to this day. Tiananmen Square is a heavily censored topic in China. When it is discussed, the CCP claims that Tiananmen was a foreign conspiracy by counter-revolutionary elements that was bravely contained by the heroes of the PLA, thanks to the wise leadership of Deng Xiaoping and the Communist Party. The truth can get you a jail sentence. Even by the early 2000s, the Tiananmen Square protests had been so thoroughly wiped from the public record that when shown the iconic Tank Man image, most students at Beijing University had no idea what the photo showed. The memory of Tiananmen remains strong elsewhere in the world. Its martyrs did not achieve the aims they hoped for, but they have still inspired others elsewhere to show the same bravery in standing against their own governments.